You're watching Breakthrough News.
I'm Charlotte Hohenstein, and you're watching Breakthrough News on BTR today. So today we're talking about the role of the Latino vote in American politics, which is one of the most coveted wildcard demographics in the US, and this is particularly topical given the midterm elections, which are coming up next week. With me to discuss is Cristobal Alex, the president of LatinoVictoryProject, which was started to empower the Latino voters in this country, not only to vote and not only to advocate on issues relating to the Latino community, but also to actually train leaders to run at all levels of office. So Cristobal, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I imagine this is a very exciting time. Could you talk a bit about whether or not you see these upcoming elections as particularly critical for Latino participation, or just part of a broader trend that's been happening over the last few years?
I do think it's a critical time for Latinos for a number of reasons. One very important reason is that I expect to see a huge increase by 1 million votes in this midterm cycle by Latino voters. 6.2 voted in 2010 in the midterm elections, and I expect over 7 million, maybe even 7.5 million in the upcoming elections. And that's important for a number of reasons. For one, it ensures that we can help decide critical races across the country and continue to build Latino political power, which is the goal of our organization. And then second, it positions us as a community to help influence what happens in the lame duck session and in the policy debates that will occur over the next 12 to 18 months. And then finally, it puts us in a position in the driver's seat as we get ready for 2016 and the presidential election.
And certainly with the presidential elections, it's been sort of successive record turnouts, I think since 1996 in terms of Latino participation, right?
That's right, that's right. The turnout continues to increase, and what's most interesting about that is where the turnout is coming from. Millennials and young Latinos are making a critical difference in the growth of our Latino vote share. If you think about it, nearly 70 Latinos turn 18 every month. That's an incredible increase, and it'll only continue to increase in the coming years. We expect that by 2020, we'll have a record number of Latinos running for office, a record number of Latinos voting, and we'll be in a position to help redraw the redistricting boundaries and then help drive policy change for the balance of the century. So all of this increase in Latino vote share is one step closer to that ultimate goal of ours, which is to get a Latina or Latino in the White House.
Very exciting. So let's back up a bit. What does it mean to be Latino in the US? Because it certainly seems like an extremely multifaceted community. And I know there was a poll done last year by Pew where actually only 20% of people would primarily describe themselves as something pan-ethnic like Latino or Hispanic, and whereas over half of them would actually go with a specific reference to their country of origin first. So what does it mean to identify as Latino?
I'll first start off by saying that we use the term, the Latino Victory Project, interchangeably with the term Hispanic. And the root of the term comes from generally Spanish-speaking countries, a shared culture, shared origin, Latin America, and or Spanish origin. And when we think about our community, you're right, it's incredibly diverse. Latinos or Hispanics in Miami-Dade are very different than Latinos in El Paso, Texas, who might call themselves Chicanos, or in San Francisco, Los Angeles, or Dominicanos or Puerto Ricans in New York City. So it's an incredibly diverse community, beautiful culture, similar languages, but it's diverse. And a mistake many people oftentimes make, particularly in politics, is they'll think of it as a monolithic voting bloc, which it clearly isn't. However, there are some unifying issues that really drive Latino turnout and participation, immigration being the forefront of those issues.
Do you think that immigration should be at the forefront, or do you think it often actually distracts, especially for non-Latino people looking on at this discourse, distracts from a lot of other things that actually does concern the Latino communities at large?
That's a great question. I'll start by saying this. The reason why it's a unifying issue for Latinos, even for folks, for example, who are Puerto Rican, they don't need to worry about immigration or citizenship because they're born as United States citizens. But they care deeply about immigration, just as Mexican Americans or Cubanos or any other ethnic component to the Latino community. And the reason why it's a unifying factor is because those on the right oftentimes use immigration to demagogue our community or to attack our community. I'll give you an example. 20 years ago, nearly to the day, California passed Proposition 187. That was the first statewide anti-immigrant ballot initiative, and the hallmark of that season was a commercial that they aired that showed a Latino family coming across the screen, and an announcer in the background says ominously, "They just keep coming," right? So that passed easily, but what it did was it spurred political participation in the Latino community because they felt attacked. Now, that was 20 years ago. It changed California politics forever, but you're starting to see something similar happen in other states, like Arizona, that had a lot of anti-immigrant efforts. We're going to see that state, I think, November 4th, change forever. We're seeing that in Oregon and Kansas and Georgia, and so that's why immigration is such a core issue, is because of the way it's been used to demagogue the community. So we all kind of come together and support a solution to a broken immigration system. But you're right, it's not the only issue. We care deeply about the environment, which is one of our core values with the Latino Victory Project. We care about education and healthcare, among other critical issues.
So from what you've described, it sounds like the role of this whole immigration discourse is, as you say, just as much it's just as much how the topic is being used by non-Latino communities that galvanizes political participation as it is the topic itself.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think what you'll see in this cycle is, despite some early projections and what some pundits have said about a diminished Latino turnout as a result of what's happened with immigration, I actually think if we do a good job in the community, we can actually use it to motivate Latino voters. And so I think in places like Colorado, which is a very tight Senate race, could in fact decide who controls the United States Senate. I think Latinos will make a difference there. And surprisingly, even in a place like Kansas, no one was talking about Kansas 6 months ago when we were thinking about the elections, but that race is coming down to the wire, and 6% of that electorate is Latino, and they're quite angry because of the Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, who's one of the most infamous anti-immigrant demagogues out there.
So we're going to take a break in a second, but before we do, so I just want to ask, and it sounds like the answer is going to be no, but do you distinguish between the terms Latino or Hispanic at all? Is there a difference, or you think, because some people seem to have a preference for one or the other?
You know, there are some technical differences. We use them interchangeably just because so many in our community use either one. I personally prefer Latino, but there are others in this room here in our office that like Hispanic, so we use it interchangeably.
Great. Well, we're going to take a break. We will be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from the latest episode of Live Studio featuring Overlord. Everyone, we are back with our discussion on the rising role of the Latino vote in the US. So, Cristobal, I want to ask you again about this poll that I referenced earlier, because another element of it, which I found particularly interesting, was that nearly 75% of Latinos, when asked how important is some sort of national leader to them to represent their interests, nearly 75% said very or extremely important, and yet almost that exact same number, it was like 71%, said that they either didn't know right now who that leader would be or that there wasn't one, full stop. So first of all, what do you make of this, and why do you think there is this lag in representation?
That's a great question. I'm glad you raised that poll again. I have a couple of responses to that. The first of which is, I think the wording of the poll was actually quite confusing. And when you look at what Latinos actually responded when they were asked to identify a leader in their community, most of them said Justice Sotomayor, who is beloved in our community. They also mentioned others like Julian Castro and his brother Joaquin Castro, among others. And I think what it shows is a couple of things. One is we're a relatively young community. I mentioned earlier that more than 50,000 Latinos turn 18 every month, and so there is that trajectory, and Latinos are starting to slowly take greater space in the public eye, whether it's the media, and we hope in politics, which is what our organization is trying to do by spotlighting Latino leaders like the Castro brothers or Lucy Flores, and there are others. I happen to think that our two founders of our organization Eva Longoria is one of those people, and Henry Munoz, who was the first Latino to ever serve as the campaign finance chair for a major political party. But we're taking those steps, and we're slowly starting to build that leadership. We just have to do a better job as a community to spotlight them, and we have to remind our friends in the media that those leadership positions are out there, those leaders are out there, and that they need to pay close attention to them.
So you think it almost waiting for the bulk of this community to sort of be growing up into political maturity almost, because it's still
I think that's exactly right. So the way I think about it, so our organization, as you pointed out early on, does a few things. We're looking to develop a leadership pipeline so we get leaders that would eventually end up in that poll you just described, that are elected to office, that are in the public eye, that are appointed to important positions like Secretary Castro, and eventually the President of the United States. We also need to make sure that we have a donor pipeline that we're building to resource this political change, and that we have a voice on elections and in policy debate. So of those three things that we're trying to do with the organization, we're looking at it through a lens of a political action committee, a super PAC, a 501c4, and a C3. And the reason why we have all of these tools in this complicated organizational infrastructure is because we as a community are just now coming into our own when it comes to this political power piece. We are about 20 years behind where the gay and lesbian equality movement was. That's kind of where I see the Latino community. We're starting to have some accountability for elected officials. We're starting to elect a greater number from our community, and we're starting to turn out in record numbers. That's about 20 years behind where the LGBT community was, and so that's, I think, a big goal for us is to get to where the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund is, or Emily's List, or some of those groups.
So in your view, it's almost it's on track. It's just a matter of keeping going in the right
on track. Exactly right. We're here's something that we're very excited about here. When you say it's on track, I think we're going to exceed a lot of expectations this year. I think we'll have an increased Latino turnout that we talked about. But here's the other important thing. I mentioned earlier we have a nation of 53 million Latinos, and only 8 are elected across the country in statewide positions. If things go well for us in less than a week, on November 4th, we may actually double the number of Latino elected officials. We may go from 8 statewide elected to 16, and that is a huge jump for our community.
No, that would be extraordinary. Does Latino Victory Project itself have a political bias? Because it certainly, I mean, it says it's non-partisan. I noticed that the people that you have endorsed recently are almost exclusively all Democrat.
So we do have a political bias. It's about building Latino political power for our own community. The reason why we are nonpartisan through our 501c4 is very important. We don't want to be taken for granted by any political party, by any candidate, and so we have to build our own power. If we're the future of the country, like our motto says, our logo behind me, then we have to take that power into our own hands. So let me give you a little bit more context here. In 2012, Latinos turned out at record numbers. More than 11 million voted. Unfortunately, more than 12 million stayed home on election day, so more eligible voters stayed home than actually voted. That is a critical problem, and that's one of the main reasons why we have a dearth of Latinos elected to public office around the country. We have to change that in order to make sure that our community's values are heard at every level of government and in the big policy fights ahead of us.
But is it coincidental that everyone you've endorsed is Democrat?
So the way we endorse candidates, I'll be very clear. We have a political action committee that does endorsements. The 501c4, which is Latino Victory Project, doesn't endorse candidates. But through the PAC, here's how we think about our candidates. They've got to represent our community and reflect Latino values, which are American values. These are things such as access to healthcare, access to opportunity, the American dream. And what I mean by that is an ample education and good jobs that pay a living wage. We also are very forthright that we support folks that want to expand democratic participation and voting rights. So if you're a candidate that doesn't believe that the earth is getting warmer because of global warming, if you think that there shouldn't be regulations, if you think that there shouldn't be a minimum wage, if you think the earth is flat, we're not going to endorse you. We're not going to support you. It just so happens right now that the candidates that best reflect those values are the ones that we selected for endorsements this year. We're very open, however, to looking at candidates from all political stripes, because ultimately, to build political power, we can't be taken for granted by any party, and so we've got to look beyond those party lines.
are going to have to we're going to have to wrap up soon, but before we do, I just want to finish asking you, and you sort of touched on this already a little bit, but just asking you what right now are the biggest challenges for Latino Victory Project going forward, and what are your biggest sources of excitement and optimism?
So the challenge that we've got, which is like a lot of startup organizations, and for us, really any political organization in the Latino space, is one about resources. It's hard to raise money from a community that is generally, they typically haven't been asked to give to a political cause like ours before, and so that's a challenge, raising sufficient resources to invest back into our community for political change. We know that these races that we're talking about across the country, whether it's for city council, for mayor, for Congress, or for Senate, are increasingly expensive. And so for us to resource and prepare candidates and to run those, we've got to raise those resources. That's the challenge. But that's also for us the biggest opportunity, because political strength for a Latino community doesn't just reside in the voting booth, it resides in our pocketbook. And so I mentioned 2012 had a record Latino turnout, but something else very important happened in 2012. There was an effort called the Futuro Fund, led by our founders, Henry Munoz and Eva Longoria, that for the very first time broke the code when it came to Latino financial giving to a political cause. And so they raised $32 million from 150,000 different donors. That had never happened before. And so we want to replicate and build on that with our organization to get Latinos investing in their own community for political change.
Well, good luck, and good luck in the upcoming elections. Thank you very much, Cristobal, for joining me. We'll be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from a bonus edition of BTR Live Studio featuring 2-inch Astronaut. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein and this is Breakthrough News. Be sure to check out breakthroughradio.com through the weekend for our continued Unexpected Week coverage, including a story on the unlikely origins of the HIV virus. That's it for what's breaking through the news today. Tell us what's breaking through your world on Twitter @Breakthrough Radio. I'm Charlotte Hohenstein and thank you for joining us.